Welcome back. I was reviewing this particular script earlier in the week, and there is a detail I keep returning to. The protagonist never raised his voice, not once. Not at the graveside, not when he found the wire transfer records, and not when he handed his wife the dissolution filing in place of the apology she expected. That restraint, surgical and deliberate, is the real weapon this story is built around. You're watching His Eternal Diary.
The smell that Ethan Cole would always associate with the last hour of his father's life was antiseptic over vending machine coffee. The specific institutional combination that meant the man was still breathing, still present, still fighting whatever slow war his heart had been losing for 3 years. He had been in room 412 of Mercy General since Thursday morning. Ethan had driven 4 hours from the city, arriving with a loose tie and a briefcase he never opened, because the moment his firm's senior paralegal, Cassandra Reyes, had forwarded him the hospital call at 11:42 a.m., every client file, every pending motion, every billable hour had simply ceased to exist. Harold Cole was 71 years old. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades in construction. Thick-knuckled, was his scarred along the left palm from a scaffolding accident in 1987, and still, even now, somehow strong-looking against the pale hospital linen. He had built Cole & Associates from 3 trucks and a rented equipment yard into a mid-sized construction firm with 28 full-time employees and 2 municipal contracts. He had built it without a business degree, without investors, without a single person telling him he could. Ethan sat in the plastic chair beside the bed and did not look at the monitors. He had looked at the monitors for 48 hours. He knew what the numbers meant now. He was a lawyer, not a physician. But numbers were numbers, and trajectories were trajectories. He looked at his father's hands instead. His phone was on the bedside table, screen facing down. Jesset had buzzed 6 times in the last hour. Twice from Nathan Park, his law partner, once from opposing counsel on the Hartwell arbitration, and 3 times from Vivian. He turned it face up on the 4th buzz. Force of habit. The screen lit. V. Ethan. Marcus's wedding is Saturday. You know I've been in the planning committee for 8 months. I can't just not show up. He stared at the message for 11 seconds. Then he set the phone face down again. Saturday was 4 days away. His father's cardiologist, a quiet man named Dr. Prem Acharya, who wore the same navy tie every morning, had spoken to Ethan in the hallway Wednesday evening, with the particular gentleness that physicians reserved for certainties they could not make official. Harold's ejection fraction had dropped to 19%. His kidneys were compensating. The body doctor, what Acharya had said, in the careful language of a man who did not want to be quoted, was reorganizing its priorities. Ethan had thanked him. Then he had returned to room 412 and sat in the plastic chair and watched his father breathe. His phone buzzed again. He did not turn it over. The coffee he had gotten from the vending machine at the end of the hall, $1.25, no name brand, just a silver can labeled coffee, had gone cold sometime around 2 a.m. He drank it anyway. It tasted like aluminum and burned sugar. It was the 4th one he had consumed since Thursday. He thought about Vivian at Marcus Webb's wedding. He was careful, when he thought about it, not to feel anything immediately. Ethan had learned this a long time ago, not in law school, where they taught you to construct arguments, but in the years before that, growing up with Harold Cole, who had never in his life allowed himself the luxury of an unprocessed emotion. Harold's rule, stated once when Ethan was 14 and had punched a wall after losing a state debate championship: feel it, then understand it, then decide what it costs you to act on it. In that order. So Ethan felt it. The way a surgeon feels the edge of a blade before making an incision. Aware of it, respecting it, not governed by it. Marcus Webb was 36 years old. He had founded a logistics software company called Nexus Platform in 2019, sold a minority stake to a private equity group in 2022, and was, at last public valuation, worth approximately $400 million. He was also the man Vivian Hartley had dated for 2 years before she met Ethan, and she had introduced them at a charity gala in 2018. A cocktail party in a rooftop venue, city lights below, the whole polished architecture of a world Ethan had worked himself into from the outside. He had shaken Marcus Webb's hand and found it practiced and dry. Vivian had told Ethan, when they started dating, that Marcus was simply a friend. Old history, comfortable, harmless, the way only exes who are truly finished ever are. Ethan had accepted this. He was, in most areas of his life, not a man who second-guessed what he could not prove. He thought about this now, in room 412, listening to his father's labored breathing, and he noticed something he filed away without comment. The thought did not arrive the way it would have a year ago. There was no spike of jealousy, no urgent need to assess, and instead, it arrived like a document he had read before, one he understood to contain information he had not yet fully valued. His father's hand moved slightly against the linen. A small movement, fingers curling, uncurling, that Ethan watched with the absolute focus of a man who understood that some things happen only once. He did not call Vivian back that night. Harold Cole died at 6:14 a.m. on Saturday. The sun was not yet above the building line outside the window. The monitors flatlined with a sound Ethan had dreaded, and then, by the final hour, almost anticipated. Not because he had given up, but because his father's breathing had changed at approximately 4 a.m. into something that was no longer quite fighting and no longer quite resting. And Ethan, who had read enough to understand the distinction, had moved his chair closer and simply held his father's hand and talked to him. He talked about the scaffolding accident. He talked about a construction site in 1994 when Harold had taken 12-year-old Ethan to walk the skeleton of a commercial building downtown, all rebar and plywood and the mineral smell of concrete, and had said, pointing to the raw framework, "This is before. It doesn't look like much. But the before is the most important part, because this is where every mistake gets made and every correction gets made, and once the walls go up, you're living with all of it." He talked about Cole and Associates' first municipal contract and the party Harold had thrown at the equipment yard, and how Harold had grilled enough food for 40 people and invited 38, and every one of them came. Well, he talked until the breathing stopped. He sat in the silence afterward for a long time. Then he took out his phone. There were 11 messages from Vivian. The most recent, sent at 11:47 p.m. Friday, which would have been the rehearsal dinner, read, "V. Ethan, I know you're not answering, but I need you to understand the position you're putting me in. Marcus and Claire specifically asked me to be there. This is not something I can walk away from. I'll be back Sunday night. I'm sorry about your father." He read the message 3 times, not to process the content. He had understood the content after the first reading. He read it 2 more times because he was making a clinical notation in the part of his mind that never fully went offline, The part that had passed the bar at 25, made partner at 31, won and built a 14-year record in corporate and estate litigation without a single malpractice claim. I'm sorry about your father. Present tense. She did not yet know Harold was dead. She had written those words as a concession, a managed acknowledgement of inconvenience, calibrated to be enough without costing her anything. He set the phone face down again. He stayed in room 412 until the hospital staff came to begin their process. He signed the forms. He spoke to the attending physician. He collected his father's personal effects, a watch, a wallet, a rosary that had belonged to Ethan's mother, dead 12 years, and placed them in the plastic bag the nurse provided, and thanked her. Then he walked to the parking garage, sat in his car for 6 minutes, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to his father's attorney, and a man named Gerald Foss, to notify him of Harold Cole's death and begin the estate process. The second was to Nathan Park. I need you to hold everything on my desk through next Thursday, Ethan said when Nathan picked up. All of it. Reassign the Hartwell arbitration to Samira. I'll take it back when I'm clear. Nathan, who had known Ethan for 9 years and understood that the flatness in his voice was not a sign of absence, but of something much colder and more deliberate, said, Done. Take what you need. I'm sorry, Ethan. Thank you. The third call was to Cassandra Reyes. Cass, I need you to pull the last 18 months of transaction records on the joint account. All of them. And the Meridian property file, the one from my father's trust. A beat of silence. The Cole family trust or the joint trust? Both. And I need the full dossier on Nexus platform that Nathan put together for the Kellerman referral last year. Don't flag it. Don't mention it to anyone. Can you do that quietly? Another beat. Already pulling it, she said. He did not explain. He simply ended the call, started the engine, and drove. The funeral was Wednesday. Ethan spent the intervening days at his father's house, a 3-bedroom colonial in a suburb 40 minutes from the city, the same house Harold had bought in 1988 and never left despite 3 separate suggestions from Ethan to upgrade. And he did the things that needed to be done. He notified Harold's employees. He called the municipal contract offices. He spoke with Gerald Foss twice and understood the estate's basic architecture. A trust, a house, the business equity, a small portfolio of municipal bonds, and 2 pieces of commercial real estate in the suburb that Harold had purchased in 2009 for prices that looked prescient now. Vivian had returned Sunday evening as promised. She had texted from the airport. Back. On my way. She had arrived at the house at 9 p.m., smelling of something expensive and floral, the specific kind of perfume that exists in a register that makes a room feel occupied by someone who knows they are being observed. Her dress was a deep wine color, slightly wrinkled from travel. She had touched Ethan's arm in the kitchen and said she was sorry. He had looked at her. He had really looked at her, the way you look at a document you know contains a misrepresentation, scanning every element of her expression for what was authentic and what was performed. She held the eye contact for a moment. Masu, then she moved toward the cabinet to get a glass of water, and in that small, decisive pivot, Ethan registered something he had never registered about Vivian before, or rather, something he had registered and categorized incorrectly for the duration of their marriage. She was not nervous. A person who had just missed a father-in-law's death to attend a social event, even a person with the emotional range of a spreadsheet, would carry some physical trace of guilt, or at minimum the management of guilt. A tightness around the mouth, a careful deliberateness in movement, something. Vivian poured her water and leaned against the counter and said, "What do you need from me this week?" Not, "I should have been here." Not, "I'm so sorry I wasn't with you." What do you need from me this week? It was a logistical question, an efficiency question. Yet the question you ask someone when the emotional accounting has already been done privately and closed. Ethan said, "I have it handled." She nodded once, and that was the conversation. He lay awake that night, listening to her breathe beside him, the light, even respiration of someone with nothing pending. And he felt the thought that had been assembling itself since room 412 reach a kind of completion. Not rage, not grief specifically, something colder and more structural, like watching a building's facade and understanding, from the precise pattern of the cracks, that the foundation has been compromised not recently but for a long time, and that what you are seeing now is simply the moment the damage became impossible to ignore. He slept 4 hours. He was up before dawn. The funeral was attended by 47 people. Ethan had expected 60 and had arranged for it, but 23 people had sent cards and flowers and polite, formatted regrets. Distance, scheduling, the vague impossibility of a Wednesday. And Ethan had noted each absence without judgment. What he had not expected was to notice, seated in the front left pew of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, in the specific way the morning light came through the stained glass window and fell across the closed casket, that he was managing his own composure with the same detachment with which he managed a courtroom. This was new. He had cried when his mother died. He had been 22, and he had wept without restraint at her bedside, and then again at her graveside, and then in the parking garage afterward in a way that felt simultaneously animal and necessary. He had not been ashamed of it. And he was not crying now. He was noting things. He noted the flowers Harold's employees had brought, a spray of white chrysanthemums from the equipment yard staff, signed by all 28 of them in a card that Gerald Foss had given Ethan before the service. He noted Gerald himself, seated 3 rows back, silver-haired and precise, a man who dealt daily in the architecture of death, and had accordingly developed a particular quality of stillness. He noted that Vivian sat beside him in a black dress that was correct in every measurable way, appropriate length, appropriate somber palette, appropriate posture, and that she had held his hand during the opening prayer, and that the pressure of her hand was the same steady, calibrated pressure it always was. She was, he recognized now, very good at appearing present. What she could not fake, and because she had not tried to, was the faint residue of the weekend still on her. Not visible, not audible. Something carried, the way certain experiences leave their imprint on a person's energy even after they have managed the surface. He had been aware of it from Sunday evening and had not named it until now. She had not been simply attending Marcus Webb's wedding. He did not know the full shape of it yet, but he had enough to know the direction. And in his experience, 14 years of reading people under oath, under cross-examination, under the specific pressure of consequence, the direction was rarely wrong. Father Drummond spoke about Harold Cole. He spoke about a man who had built things, real things, physical things, the structures that existed in the world and served the world, and who had done so with a consistency and integrity that his community had relied upon. Ethan listened. The words were accurate. They were not quite sufficient because Harold Cole was the kind of person whose actual texture, his specific density, his jokes, his 6 a.m. coffee ritual, his habit of calling his son on Sunday mornings just to read a newspaper headline aloud and demand Ethan's opinion on it could not be captured in eulogy language, which dealt in categories rather than particulars. But they were accurate. And accuracy, Ethan thought, looking at the casket, was its own form of respect. Harold Cole's business, the 2 commercial properties, the trust. These were the things Ethan needed to think about. And so he thought about them, seated in the front pew of St. Was Anthony's at his father's funeral, because Harold Cole had taught him that thinking, real thinking, was not disrespectful to grief, but was in fact the only genuine tribute a thinking man could pay. 8 months ago, Harold had suffered a minor ischemic stroke. Not debilitating, not significantly impairing, but enough, at the recommendation of Harold's cardiologist at the time, to trigger a conversation about power of attorney, the legal authority to make financial decisions on Harold's behalf if he became incapacitated. Ethan had been the obvious choice. He was a lawyer. He was Harold's son. He was local. But Harold, in the specific way Harold sometimes operated, independent to the point of stubbornness, so trusting the people he trusted without triangulating, had already had Vivian complete the paperwork before Ethan had been fully looped in. It was, Harold had explained, with the slightly sheepish directness of a man who knew he had done something awkward, because Vivian had been there that afternoon when his doctor had raised it, and she had offered, and he had accepted. Ethan had noted this at the time and let it pass. He had no particular reason to be alarmed. Vivian was his wife. Harold liked Vivian. The power of attorney was standard, limited in scope by the document itself to financial management in case of Harold's incapacitation. He had not, at the time, read the document carefully. He was a corporate attorney, not an estate attorney, and he had trusted Gerald Foss's office had reviewed it. Gerald's office had reviewed it. But Gerald's office reviewed documents for technical legality, not for strategic intent. Cassandra Reyes, who had been Ethan's paralegal for 6 years and possessed what Ethan privately considered to be one of the finest legal minds he had ever worked adjacent to, had pulled the Meridian property files over the weekend at his request. She had not asked why. She had sent them to a secure folder Monday morning with a 3-word message. Worth reading carefully. He had read them carefully. Harold Cole owned 2 pieces of commercial real estate in the suburb. The first was a warehouse property on Meridian Drive, 8,200 square feet, purchased in 2009 for $340,000. Currently assessed at $1.1 million. The second was a mixed-use building on Clearwater Avenue. Retail below, 2 apartment units above, purchased in 2011 for $510,000, was currently assessed at $890,000. Combined assessed value, just under $2 million. Both properties had been transferred via a limited liability company named Crestwood Holdings LLC within the previous 14 months. The transfer had been executed under the power of attorney Vivian held. Crestwood Holdings LLC was registered in Delaware. Ethan had had Cassandra pull the Delaware Secretary of State records. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington that specialized in privacy structuring. The listed manager of Crestwood Holdings was a man named Daniel Foray, a name Ethan had not recognized until he cross-referenced it with the Nexus Platform dossier Nathan had compiled for the Kellerman referral. Daniel Foray was Marcus Webb's chief operating officer. The transfer price of both properties, executed 11 months ago, was $1.05 million, roughly 53 cents on the assessed dollar, and significantly below any reasonable market estimate. The difference approximately $900,000 in suppressed value, had effectively been transferred through legal mechanism from Harold Cole's estate to an entity controlled by Marcus Webb's own executive. This was not an accident. This was a structured transaction designed to appear as a straightforward sale under power of attorney authority that would not survive a forensic audit. It would not survive scrutiny of market comparables. It would not survive examination of the relationship between the buyer and the person who had executed the power of attorney. Ethan had sat with this information for 48 hours before the funeral. He had not spoken to Vivian about it. He had not spoken to Marcus Webb, who was, and he noted, presumably on his honeymoon with the woman named Claire, who had been sufficiently important to Vivian to justify missing Harold Cole's final days. He had thought, carefully and completely, and he had understood the shape of what he was dealing with. He was not dealing with a wife who had made a selfish choice under pressure. He was dealing with a wife who had, at some point, he would now need to identify precisely, become a participant in a plan. And the question that mattered was not the emotional one. Not when did she stop being someone I knew, not who is she, but the legal and financial one. How much, how long, and what can be recovered? Father Drummond concluded the service. Harold Cole was buried in St. Anthony's Cemetery, 40 feet from Ethan's mother, in ground that had been frozen at the surface and soft beneath, out the way ground often is in late February. Ethan stood at the graveside in a dark wool overcoat, and he was steady. Utterly steady. The people who knew him saw this and attributed it to the particular composure of a private man in a public grief. They were half right. The other half was something he would not have been able to explain to them, not because it was complicated, but because it required a specific kind of experience to understand. The strange, cold clarity that arrives when a man who has spent his career reading deception finally understands that the most significant deception he ever failed to see was the one closest to him. It did not make him feel stupid. Harold had not raised a man who used self-blame as a substitute for action. It made him feel precise. Vivian stood beside him at the graveside and held his arm, and looked at the casket with an expression that was, he noted, very well calibrated to the moment. If he had not already known what he knew, he would have read it as grief adjacent. With what he now knew, he read it as the particular focused composure of a person managing proximity to a situation that matters to them for reasons they cannot reveal. After the burial, people came to the house. Harold's employees brought food. Gerald Foss brought a bottle of whiskey that had been Harold's preferred brand, and this gesture undid Ethan briefly. Not because of the whiskey, but because Gerald had known to bring it, which meant Gerald had known Harold in a dimension Ethan had not fully seen. And this was the kind of small revelation that accompanied death, and was genuinely terrible. Asim. He held it together. He thanked people. He accepted condolences. He made sure Harold's crew foreman, a man named Benny Ortega, who had worked for Harold for 22 years and was visibly wrecked, had a plate of food and somewhere to sit. Vivian circulated. She was good at this. The practiced movement through a room, the right words at the right volume, the particular warmth of a woman who understood social function as architecture. He watched her without appearing to watch her and noted something interesting. She was slightly more at ease than the occasion warranted. Not insensitively so. Nothing anyone else would notice. But he noticed it, because he was now watching her the way he watched a witness. Not for what they said, but for what their comfort level revealed about what they knew. She knew Harold was dead before he had called her, That was his initial read. He had not called her Saturday morning immediately. He had waited until he had completed the hospital's administrative process, until he had his father's effects in a plastic bag, until he had made his 3 phone calls. He had then called Vivian at 7:52 a.m. She had picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice had the specific alert quality of a person who has not slept, or who has been awake and waiting. She had said, "Oh God, Ethan, I'm so sorry." And then, "I'll be on the first flight back." She had not asked what time Harold had died. She had not asked if Ethan had been with him. In Ethan's experience, which included 14 years of deposing people whose lives depended on their believability. Thus, the questions a person fails to ask reveal as much as the ones they ask openly. He had filed this without comment and focused on the week's requirements. By the time the last guest left Harold's house, it was Benny Ortega, who shook Ethan's hand for a long time without speaking, and then drove away in a truck with a Cole & Associates logo that would need to be updated. It was 9:30 p.m. Vivian was in the kitchen, beginning the post-gathering cleanup with the efficiency she applied to all domestic logistics. Ethan sat at his father's kitchen table, Formica top, chrome legs, 1970s vintage, the table on which Harold had done every financial document of his adult life. And he opened his laptop. He had 2 emails waiting. One from Cassandra Reyes, marked secure. One from Nathan Park. He opened Cass's first. And her message was 3 paragraphs and an attachment, a detailed transaction timeline covering the previous 22 months of the joint account he shared with Vivian. She had also pulled the corporate filings for Crestwood Holdings from 3 separate states and cross-referenced the signatory on the Delaware filing with the Nexus platform records. The 3rd paragraph read, "I also found something you didn't ask for but should see. Attached to Crestwood's operating agreement is a consulting services contract dated 13 months ago. The contracted party is a company called VH Advisory Group, LLC. VH Advisory is registered in Wyoming. The registered agent is Gregory Hartley, Vivian's father. But the listed managing member, buried in the amendment filed 9 months ago, is Vivian Hartley Cole." He read this twice. And then he opened Nathan's email, which was 3 words. "Call me tonight." He closed the laptop and looked at the kitchen. At the Formica table, and the window above the sink, and the particular quality of silence that settles into a house after its primary occupant has departed. He heard Vivian running water in the other room. He did not call Nathan. Not yet. He sat in his father's kitchen in the specific silence of a decision being made, not the theatrical kind, not the kind that requires an audience or a moment of visible resolve, but the quiet, interior kind, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Because by the time you reach it, you have already been moving toward it for longer than you knew. He would not grieve tonight. He would grieve later, in private, in whatever form that took. It was right now the man Harold Cole had built. The man who understood that construction required sequence, that sequence required clarity, that clarity was not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain determine the order of operations, was the only version of himself that was useful. He opened the laptop again and began to build a document. He called it, simply, Structure. The first section was titled, Known. He worked for 2 hours. The known elements were these: a power of attorney executed by Vivian Cole as attorney-in-fact for Harold Cole, dated 8 months prior. 2 real property transfers executed under that power of attorney to Crestwood Holdings, LLC, at a combined price of $1.05 million, approximately 53 cents on the assessed dollar. Crestwood Holdings, controlled by Daniel Foray, COO of Nexus Platform, a company owned by Marcus Webb. VH Advisory Group, a Wyoming LLC, listed as a consulting contractor to Crestwood Holdings at $18,500 per month for 12 months, $222,000 total, with Vivian Cole as managing member. Joint account withdrawals over 22 months of $347,000, described in transaction notes as investment allocations and advisory services, routed to an account at a bank Ethan had never seen on a statement before and would not have noticed without Cassandra's audit. Total direct and indirect benefit to Vivian and parties acting in coordination with her, north of $1.5 million. He stared at the number. Not because it was surprising. He had suspected a version of this since Saturday morning, when the transaction records first arrived. But because seeing it rendered into arithmetic had a specific quality, and it was no longer a hypothesis, it was a figure. It had mass. He moved to the second section. Legal exposure. The power of attorney instrument, if executed at a time when Harold Cole possessed full legal capacity, which he had, and if used to benefit the attorney-in-fact or her associates in transactions where those parties stood to profit, was a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. Under the Uniform Power of Attorney Act, which governed in their state, an attorney-in-fact was prohibited from using the power of attorney to benefit herself or her associates unless the instrument specifically authorized it. Harold's instrument did not contain such authorization. Gerald Foss had confirmed this in a Monday morning conversation, during which Ethan had asked, carefully and without alarming anyone, whether the power of attorney had contained any self-dealing provisions. It had not. This meant the property transfers were voidable. The estate, through Harold's executor, which was Ethan, named in Harold's trust, had legal standing to challenge both transactions. The argument was structurally sound. The attorney-in-fact, Vivian Cole, had a material undisclosed financial interest in the buyer entity, Crestwood Holdings, through her consulting relationship with VH Advisory Group. The transfers at below-market prices constituted a breach of fiduciary duty and were subject to voiding and recovery under estate law. The second exposure was the consulting payments. VH Advisory had received $222,000 from Crestwood Holdings in the 12 months following the property transactions. This money had flowed, via Wyoming, into accounts Ethan would now need to fully trace. But he had enough of the structure to understand that a forensic accountant, and he knew 2 of the best in the country, could reconstruct the full flow in 3 to 6 weeks. The third exposure was Nexus Platform itself. Marcus Webb's company had acquired 2 pieces of commercial real estate at below-market prices through an entity controlled by his own COO. Depending on how Nexus was structured, and the Kellerman dossier suggested Webb had completed a secondary equity offering 18 months ago, which meant he had outside investors with disclosure rights. There were securities obligations around material acquisitions that Crestwood's deal may have triggered. This was an SEC matter. It was not Ethan's primary arena, but he had a contact at the agency who handled exactly this category of referral. He moved to the third section. Sequence. This was the part that required the most precision, because sequence in litigation was everything. Premature moves revealed strategy. Delayed moves surrendered leverage. The ideal sequence was the one that assembled the full legal picture before any party knew the picture was being assembled. He estimated, a window of approximately 3 weeks before Vivian would become suspicious. She had returned from the wedding confident and composed. She had no visible reason to believe anything had changed. She was managing what she understood to be Ethan's grief, a manageable, temporary condition, while simultaneously, he now understood, as maintaining a financial structure that had been constructed over the better part of 2 years. 3 weeks was enough. He typed the sequence. 1. Engage Philip Morse, the forensic accountant, under attorney-client privilege to reconstruct the full financial flow. Begin with the joint account withdrawals and trace backward and forward through every connected entity. 2. Commission a formal appraisal of the Meridian Drive and Clearwater Avenue properties by a certified commercial appraiser independent of both parties. This would establish, on the record, the market value at the time of transfer and quantify the below-market differential. 3. Retain an estate litigation specialist, not someone from his firm, because his firm did corporate work, and this needed to be unimpeachable and conflict-free, to draft the formal challenge to the property transfers on behalf of Harold Cole's estate. 4. Complete the divorce filing. Serve it quietly and precisely, on a day and in a manner that gave Vivian the minimum possible time to coordinate with Marcus Webb or her father before service was complete. 5. File the estate challenge simultaneously with the divorce so that the assets in dispute were immediately clouded by lis pendens notation and could not be moved, refinanced, or otherwise dissipated pending judicial resolution. 6. The SEC referral, the one with the longest fuse and the most structural consequence. Nexus Platforms' disclosure obligations around material acquisitions made at below-market prices by entities controlled by company executives were potentially significant under Regulation SK. The referral would initiate an inquiry that could take months, but in those months, Marcus Webb's company would be under regulatory scrutiny that would suppress any planned equity activity. He had learned from the Kellerman file that Webb was positioning for a Series B round within 18 months. An SEC inquiry, even a preliminary one, would freeze that entirely. He closed the document. He sat back. The kitchen was quiet. The water sounds from the other room had stopped, and he heard Vivian's footsteps on the hallway floor. A particular cadence he had spent 3 years of marriage memorizing without knowing he was doing it. And then they stopped outside the kitchen doorway. "Coming to bed?" she said. He looked up. He looked at her the way he would look at a document he was about to execute, fully present, fully without illusion, and he said, "In a minute." She studied him briefly. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, not quite. Something more considered, more watchful, the expression of a person who has assessed an environment and found it currently safe. "Okay," she said, and she went to bed. He closed the laptop, sat in his father's kitchen for another 30 minutes, and then called Nathan. "The Kellerman file," Ethan said when Nathan picked up. "I need everything on Nexus Platforms' capital structure, equity holders, board composition, the investor deck from their 2022 raise, and I need the name of your contact at the SEC, the one who handled the Orion referral." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, I know. How bad is it?" "The number I'm working with, before full forensic reconstruction, is around 1.5 million, with the real property below market transfers, potentially closer to 2. Nathan's exhale was slow and measured, the way a man exhales when he knows he will not be able to talk the other person off a ledge and has decided not to try. "Philip Morse," he said, "already on my list. Who's doing the estate challenge?" "I was thinking Sandra Vieth." "She's the best." A pause. "Ethan?" Pause. "Are you all right?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which meant he did not default to the reflexive answer. "I'm clear," he said. "That's what I am right now." Clear. Nathan seemed to understand the distinction. "I'll have everything on your desk by Friday." "Not my desk," Ethan said. "Your desk. I'm not going back to the office yet." "Understood." He ended the call at 11:47 p.m. He went to bed. He lay in the dark beside Vivian, who was asleep, and he thought about nothing, deliberately, precisely nothing. And he slept for 6 hours without interruption. He drove back to the city Thursday morning. Vivian assumed he was returning to work and did not offer to accompany him, which he noted. He settled into the apartment, their apartment. Yes, the one on the 22nd floor with the city spread below it like a diagram of itself. And he began. Philip Morse was a forensic accountant who operated from a small office in a building that smelled of recycled air and very good coffee, and who had the specific quality of a man who had seen every variety of financial concealment the human imagination could devise and had never once lost interest in finding them. Ethan had used him on 3 corporate litigation matters. He trusted Philip's methodology completely. He met with Philip on Friday morning and laid out the transaction structure, the power of attorney, the property transfers, the VH advisory consulting arrangement, the joint account withdrawals. He was concise and complete. Philip made notes in a yellow legal pad in a handwriting so small it was nearly illegible to anyone but himself. When Ethan finished, Philip looked up and said, "How far back do you want me to go?" 3 years, Ethan said. Philip nodded. He named a fee. Ethan accepted it. Philip said he would have a preliminary report in 10 days. Ethan met Sandra Vieth that same Friday afternoon. Sandra Vieth was 53 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in a manner that suggested she had never in her professional life felt the need to appear intimidating because she had never needed to. She simply was. She had practiced estate and trust litigation for 28 years and had argued before the state Supreme Court on fiduciary duty questions twice. Ethan had referred 2 clients to her and tracked her record closely. But he had never worked opposite her and had no interest in experiencing that. He laid out the same structure. Sandra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Uniform P.O.A. Act provides for voiding of transactions where the attorney, in fact, has an undisclosed interest. The consulting relationship you have described, through VH Advisory, into Crestwood, establishes the interest. The below-market transfer price establishes the benefit. The question is whether the power of attorney instrument itself contained language that could be read as authorizing self-dealing." "It did not," Ethan said. "I have confirmed this with Gerald Foss." Sandra nodded. "Then we have the framework. I will need the full instrument, both deeds, the Crestwood operating agreement, and the VH advisory consulting contract, and I want Philip Morse's forensic report as soon as it is available." "You will have it." She looked at him steadily. "I want to be direct with you, because this will move quickly once we file. Are you prepared for what happens when your wife understands the scope of what she is facing?" He met her gaze. "I filed for divorce Monday." Sandra absorbed this without visible reaction. The filing has been served? Tuesday morning, a process server met her at the airport when she landed from a trip. He did not elaborate on where she had been or why. He did not need to. The facts were the facts, and the facts were what Sandra Vieth worked with. Sandra said, "Then she already knows the landscape has changed." She knows part of it. And the estate challenge? Filed simultaneously with the dissolution, only under seal so pending the forensic audit completion. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, and he noted this because it was not a small thing, Sandra Vieth, in 28 years, had developed the professional habit of not expressing personal reactions to client situations. She said, "That was well timed." "It needed to be," Ethan said. Here is what Vivian had expected when she landed at the airport Tuesday morning, returning from what Ethan would later learn had been not merely Marcus's wedding, but a post-wedding stay at the Amalfi Coast property of Marcus Webb's private equity partner. A stay she had described, across 6 days of sparse text messages, as the reception planning extending, and the whole group just needed to decompress. She had expected the car service she had arranged. She had expected the apartment. Well, she had expected a husband who was, by Tuesday, returning to some form of normal function. Grief cycling down, routine reestablishing, the particular predictability of a man who managed everything through structure and work. She had not expected a woman in a dark suit standing at the arrivals barrier holding an envelope. Ethan knew this because Cassandra, who had a contact at the process service company, had been told, not in any official capacity, simply in the way that people who are very good at their jobs notice things, that the recipient had stood very still for approximately 4 seconds after opening the envelope, and then had asked the server if there was a mistake. The server had confirmed there was not. Vivian had then made 3 phone calls in rapid succession in the arrivals hall, and had then gotten into a car, and had then, as of Cassandra's last update, checked into a hotel rather than going to the apartment. Ethan was at the apartment when this happened. He had sat in the reading chair by the window that looked out over the city, the chair where he had spent hundreds of hours with briefs and contract documents, and the coffee that was always too hot, and the city that was always too loud, and the specific background hum of a life he had built, and was now disassembling with the same deliberateness with which he had built it. And he had let his mind be quiet. He thought about his father's hands. He thought about the scaffolding accident, and the construction site, and the 1994 building skeleton, and what Harold had said about the before. He thought about what it cost to see clearly, not the financial cost, which was manageable, and not the legal cost, which was already in motion. The other cost, the one that did not have a number. He sat with it. He gave it its full weight. He did not compress it or manage it or route it through any of the structures he used to manage everything else. Then he set it aside. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. V. He let it ring. She called twice more that evening. He did not answer either call. He ate dinner, leftover soup from a container in the refrigerator, consumed standing at the kitchen counter. And he worked until midnight on the structure document, which had now expanded to 37 pages and 3 annexed exhibits. Philip Morse's preliminary report arrived 9 days later. It was 42 pages and 3 spreadsheets, and it was, even for Ethan, who had read hundreds of forensic accounting reports, and a remarkable piece of construction. Philip had traced the financial architecture with the precision of someone who found visible pleasure in the reconstruction process. The summary. The joint account withdrawals over 22 months totaled $312,400. The withdrawals had been routed through two intermediate accounts, one in the name of VH Advisory Group, one in the name of a personal account at a regional bank that Vivian had opened 30 months ago and not disclosed in any of their joint financial documentation. The commercial real estate transfers had occurred at a combined $1.05 million against a Philip established market value at time of transfer of $1.94 million, a below-market transfer of $890,000. VH Advisory had received $222,000 in consulting payments from Crestwood Holdings, confirmed with full wire documentation. What total financial benefit to Vivian and associated parties? $1,424,400. At the bottom of the summary section, in the precise, unadorned language Philip used for everything, was a single additional line. I have also identified 4 wire transfers, totaling $96,500 from VH Advisory to an account registered to Gregory Hartley, individually. These transfers appear to be unrelated to any documented business purpose. He stared at this line for a long time. Vivian's father. This altered the architecture slightly. Not the strategy. The strategy was already in motion, but the full picture of the organization. Gregory Hartley had not been a passive registered agent. He had not been a legal vessel acting on a daughter's instruction without awareness of the purpose. He had been a paid participant. Ethan forwarded the report to Sandra Vieth, and he copied Philip and asked him to expand the Hartley analysis to the full extent the records allowed. Then he called Nathan. "The SEC referral," he said. "I want to file it this week." "Are you certain?" Nathan said. "I'm certain. Once that goes in, it enters a formal record. Webb will understand what is happening." "Webb already knows," Ethan said. "Vivian called someone from that arrivals hall within 4 minutes of receiving service. I know his number is not the first one she would dial, but I would be surprised if it was not in the first 3. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "The referral is solid. The below-market acquisition by an entity controlled by his COO. If he had any knowledge of the below-market pricing, that creates a disclosure exposure under Regulation SK. Even if he claims ignorance, but the inquiry alone will flag the deal for any institutional investor doing due diligence on his next raise." "Which is the point," Ethan said. The SEC referral was filed that Thursday. Ethan did not announce it. He did not send a message to Vivian, or to Marcus Webb, or to Gregory Hartley. He filed it through the proper channel, as a good-faith referral from a practicing attorney who had identified potential disclosure irregularities in the reported activities of a public-facing company. The referral cited the Crestwood Holdings acquisition, the below-market pricing, the COO's direct control of the acquiring entity, and the existing forensic accounting findings regarding VH Advisory Group's consulting payments and their flow. He then returned to the substance of the settlements of the estate litigation. When Sandra had filed the formal challenge to the property transfers in probate court. The filing clouded both properties, meaning neither could be sold, transferred, refinanced, or otherwise disposed of pending judicial resolution. Crestwood Holdings, through its Delaware registered agent, received service of the filing 10 days after Ethan had sat in the reading chair and listened to Vivian's unanswered calls. The dissolution proceedings moved on a parallel track. Vivian had retained an attorney. His name was Adrian Cross, a family law practitioner who was competent and reasonably aggressive, and who had, in his first communication to Ethan's divorce attorney, a woman named Petra Solano, on whom Nathan had referred, and who had the particular quality of someone who had never lost interest in the precise details of other people's legal wars, suggested that the estate-related filings appeared to be retaliatory in nature, and that his client reserved all rights to challenge the propriety of the filing sequence. Ethan had read this and experienced, in some remote register, something that was almost amusement, retaliatory, as if the order of operations was the argument rather than the underlying facts that necessitated it. He did not respond to this through Petra directly. He let it sit. The prenuptial agreement he and Vivian had signed, a document that Gregory Hartley's attorney had contested hard 3 years prior, just in a way Ethan had noted at the time, and then filed as standard position-taking, was clear on the question of individual assets. Property brought into the marriage individually remained individual. What it was less clear on was the question of marital funds that had been invested or managed by one spouse independently and without the other's knowledge. Adrian Cross's strategy, as Ethan reconstructed it through Petra's analysis, was to argue that Vivian's management of joint funds through VH Advisory was a legitimate investment activity, that she had been functioning as a financial steward of marital assets, and that the consulting payments received were a return on investment, not a diversion of marital funds. This argument required the court to accept that Vivian's undisclosed investment entity, transacting exclusively with an LLC controlled by her former partner's COO at below-market prices, from assets held under a power of attorney over her husband's incapacitated father, constituted a good-faith investment activity conducted for the benefit of the marital estate. Philip Morse's 42 pages said otherwise. Sandra Vieth's estate filing said otherwise. The VH Advisory Operating Agreement, which had been produced in discovery, and which listed no investment mandate, no diversified client base, and no business purpose beyond advisory services rendered to a single entity, said otherwise. Ethan sat through 3 weeks of the divorce proceedings in the particular way he sat through every proceeding, still attentive, keeping his face in a register that communicated interest but not investment, all because judges reacted to a party who appeared too vested. And Ethan had spent 15 years cultivating the specific quality of a man who was completely present and completely controlled. Vivian, in the proceedings, was composed. She wore the correct colors. She listened to Adrian Cross and spoke when instructed. She did not look at Ethan the way Ethan might have expected someone to look at a spouse they had systematically deceived, with guilt or anger or the particular defiance of a person who has decided their justification is sufficient. She looked at him the way a person looks at a variable in a negotiation that has not yet concluded. She was calculating. She was still calculating. This was, he realized, who she had been all along. He was simply seeing it now, without the interference of whatever he had chosen to see instead. At one afternoon, during a break in proceedings, she approached him in the corridor. Petra had stepped away to take a call. Adrian Cross was at the other end of the hall. It was just the two of them in a courthouse hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air and the specific particular heaviness of other people's concluded arrangements. Vivian looked at him. She was, objectively, a beautiful woman. This was not a thing that had changed, and he registered it without weight. Beauty was a fact, not an argument. "You could have talked to me," she said. Her voice had the careful inflection of someone who had workshopped the line in advance. He looked at her. He looked at her with the same careful, complete attention he had used in room 412, at his father's graveside, in his father's kitchen, in the reading chair by the window. Your process server met me at the airport," she said. "I had just landed. I had been on a plane for 9 hours. I know, he said. That's how you chose to do it. He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the hospital antiseptic, and the silver coffee can, and the 4 hours of driving, and the 48 hours in a plastic chair, and the phone face down on a hospital bedside table. He thought about the message written in present tense. I'm sorry about your father, as a managed concession calibrated to be sufficient without costing her the weekend. He said, You had already chosen how you were going to do it. I was responding to the architecture you built. She held his gaze. Something moved through her expression that was, he thought, just the most genuine thing he had seen from her in however long. Some trace of the actual calculation she was running, the revision of her internal model of what he knew and what he was willing to use. The properties, she said. It was not a question. And the joint account, he said. And VH Advisory. And the referral to the SEC, which I assume you have heard about by now. She absorbed this. He watched the absorption happen in real time, the reordering, the assessment of what was recoverable and what was not. What Marcus is going to do, Ethan said, is have a very difficult Series B, if he manages to do it at all. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, You're not angry. No, he said. That's the part that worries me. He said nothing. She looked at him for another moment. And then Adrian Cross was back at the end of the hall, and Petra Solano was coming around the corner with her leather folder, and the brief window of unmanaged space between them closed. Vivian walked back to her attorney. Ethan watched her go, and felt nothing that could be called satisfaction in the conventional sense, and nothing that could be called grief in the conventional sense. Something more functional than either. The specific quality of completion that arrives when a sequence you designed has reached its terminal architecture and the outcome is what you projected. The estate litigation resolved in 7 months. Sandra Vaeth was efficient and filed documents with the specific completeness of a practitioner who understood that courts responded to evidence organized to make a conclusion difficult to avoid. The probate judge voided both property transfers on the grounds that Vivian Cole had violated her fiduciary duties as attorney-in-fact under the state's Uniform POA Act through an undisclosed material interest in the buyer entity. Crestwood Holdings was ordered to return both properties to Harold Cole's estate, along with $64,000 in rents collected during the 14 months of Crestwood's ownership. The estate recovered approximately $952,000 in total. This went into Harold's trust, and then, per the trust's terms, to its sole beneficiary, Ethan. The consulting payments, the $222,000 to VH Advisory, were addressed in the divorce proceedings under the marital waste doctrine. Funds withdrawn from the marital estate without the other spouse's knowledge or consent are deployed for the benefit of the withdrawing spouse or coordinating third parties. Philip Morse's reconstruction was admitted as evidence. Adrian Cross's investment activity argument was dismantled efficiently by the admission of the VH Advisory Operating Agreement, which contained no investment mandate, no diversified purpose, and no legitimate business rationale beyond the generation of fees from a single entity already connected to the property scheme. The court found marital waste. The joint account withdrawals of $312,400, reclassified accordingly, were credited to Ethan's share of the marital estate division. The prenuptial agreement held on all individual assets. Vivian walked away from the marriage with what she had brought into it. Her personal accounts, her personal property, or her car, and nothing of what had been constructed in the 3 years of their union. Gregory Hartley's $96,500 in transfers from VH Advisory were addressed separately. Philip Morse had included the analysis in a supplementary report that became part of the estate litigation record, and the probate judge had forwarded it to the state attorney general's office as a matter of standard practice when financial irregularities involving third parties emerged in estate proceedings. What happened next was between Gregory Hartley and the Attorney General's office. Ethan did not follow it with close attention. It was not his matter to follow. The SEC inquiry into Nexus Platform opened formally 3 months after the referral. It was not, from what he could observe through public records, resolved quickly. Was Nexus Platform's planned Series B round had not been announced on the timeline Marcus Webb had discussed in the Kellerman investor deck. It had not, as of the last information available to Ethan, been announced at all. He did not think about Marcus Webb much. He thought about Marcus Webb the way you think about a structural failure in a building someone else owns, with the professional interest of a person who understands load-bearing points, and without personal investment in the outcome. The apartment was his. The furniture was divided through Petra's process, which was efficient and precise. The books, 340 of them, accumulated across a shared life that had been, he understood now, only partially shared, were divided by the same process. He kept the Cole family photographs, the kitchen table his father had given them as a wedding gift, and a painting he had bought alone at an auction before the marriage, that he had always loved, and that Vivian had tolerated the way she tolerated many things that were not useful to her in an immediately actionable way. He moved into a smaller apartment on the 14th floor. It looked out over a different quarter of the city. The mornings there had a quality he had not anticipated. Quieter, somehow, despite the city being identical to the city he had always known. He worked. He returned to the Hartwell arbitration, which Samira had held together with impressive competence during his absence. He took 2 new clients. He called Nathan to lunch twice in the months following the resolution and paid both times, which was not their usual arrangement, but which Nathan accepted without comment, because Nathan understood what the gesture meant. He went to his father's grave on the first Sunday of every month. He brought nothing. No flowers, no objects, because Harold Cole had never placed stock in gesture when presence was the thing that actually counted. He simply stood there for some variable amount of time and thought about his father specifically. The hands, the scaffolding accident, the equipment yard party, the Sunday morning newspaper calls. He was, in the ways that could be measured, all right. Cassandra Reyes had, in the months of the litigation, functioned with a precision and loyalty that Ethan had noted carefully and not yet adequately acknowledged. And he rectified this by recommending her to the firm's partners committee for a senior paralegal designation and a corresponding salary adjustment, and by writing the recommendation himself in language that did not require the committee to do anything but confirm what was already evident to anyone paying attention. She accepted the designation with the exact same composure she applied to everything. He suspected she had been prepared to accept it for some time. He was in his office, a Thursday evening in late October, when she appeared in the doorway with a case file and said, before handing it over, "New estate matter. Potential POA abuse. The family has been referred to us by Gerald Foss." He took the file. He looked at her. He said, "Who held the power of attorney?" "An adult child," she said. "From the transaction records. Yes, it looks like they structured it so the assets transferred to a company they controlled, at undervalued prices, over a period of about 2 years." He was very still for a moment. Then, "Same mechanism." "Same mechanism," she agreed. He opened the file. He read the first page. Then he looked up at the window, the office window, with the city below it, and the particular quality of late October light that comes in at an angle and turns everything briefly gold. And he was aware, in a way that required no particular management, that the work he was about to do existed in part because of what had been done to Harold Cole, and that this was the specific form the accounting had taken. Harold Cole had built things that stood in the world and served purposes beyond himself. Ethan built different structures. The materials were different. But the underlying principle, the thing Harold had tried to describe in the skeleton of that 1994 building, was the same. Everything depends on the before, on the part where the mistakes get made and the corrections get made, and the foundation is either right or it isn't. He began to read. He was 3 pages in when his phone lit on the desk. A text from a number he had deleted, but whose last 4 digits he still recognized, because 14 years of legal training had made him constitutionally incapable of not recognizing things. V. I heard about the SEC inquiry expanding. I think you should know. The whole structure, the properties, the advisory company, none of it was originally my idea. I think you deserve to know that. He read this. He turned the phone face down. He continued reading the file. And he did not think about what Vivian meant. Whether it was true, whether it was a prelude to a cooperation offer, whether she was attempting to establish a narrative for reasons he could not fully see from his current position. He noted the text's existence, assigned it a folder in the part of his mind labeled Not Currently Relevant, and returned to the family in the case file in his hands. They had a father. Whatever the texture of that father, the specific weight of his presence, his habits, the particular irreplaceable quality that no estate document and no legal recovery and no correctly sequenced litigation could restore, they had lost him to the same mechanism. And they were sitting, somewhere, with whatever version of grief and clarity they were carrying, and needing someone who understood from the inside what had been done and how to name it precisely. Page 4. The transaction logs. A pattern Ethan now recognized immediately, the way you recognize a piece of architecture you have studied until it exists in your peripheral vision. The evening city pressed against the glass. The late October light finished its long angle and went flat and gray, and then, in the way cities do, simply dark. Cassandra brought him coffee from the kitchen machine without being asked. It was not good coffee, it never was, but it was hot, and set it on the corner of the desk, and left without a word, because she understood when words were not the thing required. He worked until 11. He took the elevator to the lobby and walked out into the October air, yet which was cold and direct in the way only late autumn city air manages to be, without apology, without warmth, without pretense of anything except what it is. He turned up his collar. He walked.